Thanks everyone for showing up today to our branching out session. This is part two of our funder communication series. This one is focusing on funder insights on metrics and storytelling. If you missed part one, that's okay. We'll give a brief overview of that, and also a recording is available on our YouTube channel. I can share that afterwards if you're interested. Oops. So the purpose of today's session is, again, this is a two-part series, and we're exploring metrics and stories that resonate when communicating the impacts of forest treatments for wildfire risk reduction, watershed resilience. So in session one, we really listened to like what's going on with collaboratives, what's going well, what are some challenges, how can, what are our ideas for different metrics that we can use. And now in this session, we're going to flip the script and hear from various public and private sector fundings on their perspectives and things that they're interested in and things that they're learning and all of that good stuff. So just for a very brief recap, if you missed part one of our series, like I said, this recording is available if you want a full recap. But we started off that session with a few takeaways from existing literature. Julie Shapiro from Keystone Policy Institute kicked us off with that. Then we heard a really interesting presentation from Chaska Woiwaka and Max Cook from the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute talking about creative metrics from the Northern Colorado Watershed Collaborative. So that was kind of a real life example. And then we got into a discussion, and I'm just going to go through some of the key points. This certainly wasn't everything that we talked about, but a few key takeaways from our discussion included. So the first question that we talked about was what stories and data and metrics have been most effective in building support for your work in forest and watershed resilience. A key takeaway here was kind of this idea of striking a balance of visuals, data, and stories in order to tell the best story and also reach the greatest variety of funders in one go. So kind of balancing visuals. This could include before and after photos, infographics, things like that. Stories, including highlighting people. So this could be highlighting the people behind the work, like the people on this call, but also highlighting the people that the work impacts. So communities, landowners, et cetera. And then another one that came up a lot was stories of fires interacting with treatments. So what didn't happen that could have happened if this treatment hadn't been here, and other lessons learned. And then data. This is kind of the metrics that I think most of us are more used to communicating. So like priority areas treated, acres treated, volunteering hours, defensible space, et cetera. So kind of finding a balance of those things have been the most effective so far that people have found. And then we asked what challenges people have faced in communicating impact and what have you learned from those challenges. So some of the challenges that we heard multiple times were getting on the same page. So getting on the same page with funders and better understanding what the funder wants to know. And then also getting on the same page with partners and leadership internally and figuring out what metrics are most meaningful and where do we want to put our time. Speaking of time, another challenge that I'm sure we're all familiar with is time, expertise, and capacity to be able to tell a good story. It takes a lot to really merge those three things that I was talking about on the first slide. Another common challenge that people talked about is the timeline mismatch, just because of the nature of forestry work. Sometimes the story isn't over or it isn't ready to tell meaningfully in a typical grant reporting time frame. And lastly, someone just wrote the story is complicated. And I think that's very true as well. And lastly, and this slide will kind of kick into what we're going to talk about today. What do you wish funders and decision makers understood about this work? And what would you like to hear from them? Again, we heard a lot, but just a couple of the key takeaways here. People want funders to understand the importance of local buy-in and achieving on-the-ground outcomes, like the role of local buy-in and getting to those outcomes, and also all of the time, trust, relationships that it takes to get that local buy-in. And then as far as what do we want funders to, or what do we want to hear from funders? People said they would love to help to understand what motivates funders so that they can tell the best story to the funder. And then one question that came up is how do the people doing the work tie different funding sources together? And what does that look like behind the scenes? Like, what conversations are funders having as far as how to tie funding sources together to maximize their impact? So that was a really brief overview of session one. And now, again, we're going to kind of flip the script and hear from funders this time and hear their perspectives. So a bit of overview. Welcome from me. I'm soon going to pass to Julie Shapiro from Keystone Policy Center, and she's going to go through some foundation building, talk a little bit more about like how this session came to be and what our goals are. And then we have a very exciting panel lined up for you that I'm really excited. We've got Ben Guijan from Net Earth. Oh, I'm so sorry. I might have mixed up Ben and Tom's last name. um, yeah, I'm sorry. That was bad
No, you
facilitation.
got it right.
Oh,
You
okay.
got it right on this.
Okay. Um, and then Marianne Whitman, Tom Gujan from Gates Family Foundation, Marianne Whitman from Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and Courtney Young from the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. And we'll give a little bit more introduction momentarily. And then what is going to come out of this session? First and foremost, we hope to just help collaboratives, the people on this call, to better understand metrics and messaging that can drive investment and show impact. We're also using insights from this session and the last session to build into a white paper that the work group is developing around metrics. So that'll tie in some of the uh, pre-reading that Julie had shared on our last session, as well as what we're learning from this and other calls. And then we will do some sort of follow-up session at the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network, Colorado Forest Collaboratives Summit, which is coming up in September. So with that, I'm going to pass to Julie Shapiro from Keystone Policy Center to continue the rest of our discussion.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for co-hosting with us. We're excited to have this conversation today. I will be the facilitator for the panel. And again, my name is Julie Shapiro, and I lead the Natural Resources Center at Keystone. And as part of that, I'm a facilitator for the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment. I won't dwell on these discussion guidelines. The main thing I just wanted to call out is that we are recording the plenary discussion, and if we do use breakouts, we're going to make a game time decision on that one later. Then we won't record those. And so if you find yourself in a breakout group, just please avoid attribution. You can take the ideas, whether you just leave the names behind. So that's the main point in that slide. So let's go to the next one. Um, and I just want to tell you a little bit. I spent a little more time on this in the last session, and you may have heard me describe the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado in other fora. But just really briefly, this is a group that's come together in the past year and a half to advance statewide sustainable public-private funding strategies, focus on enhancing the pace wildfire risk reduction and watershed resilience. And I don't probably need to tell this crowd too much about the potential impacts of catastrophic wildfire, but this group really came together recognizing that those impacts include to our economy, safety, watersheds, infrastructure, and communities, and more. And so while funding is not the only piece of the puzzle to address pace and scale, it is where this initiative is trying to focus in supporting public and private and local and statewide solutions. So if you go to the next slide, Katie. Um, the first and foremost goal is really around how do we help it increase the amount of sustainable funding for catastrophic wildfire risk reduction and watershed resilience. And there's a number of strategies, as I just mentioned, that we're pursuing. You may hear about all of those in some ways over the course of the panel discussion, whether it's statewide and local public funding measures or private public funding opportunities, or investing in the forest restoration economy that can help drive local economies and also reduce stewardship costs. A secondary goal for work is in order to support that primary goal around funding, it's to advance engagement with policies, metrics, storytelling. So thinking about what are the enabling levers to help get people more interested in and understanding the importance of investment in proactive wildfire and watershed treatment. Let's go to the next slide. And this next one is I showed this on the first of these two sessions, and I showed a lot more in terms of what we were seeing in some of the research and white papers, but this was just a takeaway slide that I'll carry over from that last conversation. So as we've looked into what are the metrics folks use and that move people, we've heard a lot, as Katie said, about the importance of storytelling in addition to metrics and data. And we've started gathering examples of what seems to resonate most with folks from the data perspective. And that's in asking, utilities or other stakeholders, why would you invest? So just some examples about wildfire risk, wildfire severity reduction, and then return on investment in particular. There's several studies out there that look at return on investment, whether it's watershed focused, you see 7 to 1 or 4 to 1 in terms of the benefits for water infrastructure and watersheds. And then when you think about the broader benefits of, not just protecting life and property, which is very important, but also just the ripple effects to economies and communities in the event of a catastrophic wildfire, 13 to 1 is an ROI that we hear about a lot, and that's from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So those are big numbers, and a lot of factors go into those. But what we're going to try to focus in on today is what is it that motivates funders to think about investing in this work? And if you go to the next slide, Katie, you can see just some of the sample questions we're going to be covering today. So that, this is just a assemblage of questions, and we'll have time for audience questions too. But we'll be exploring what metrics and outcomes funders value or prioritize, and how collaboratives can better align with that when seeking funding. What's the role of public-private partnerships and innovative partnership models, including innovative funding models that can support funders working together to align investments. From some of the questions asked in that first session, we also have some questions around how do you think about those longer term capacity and maintenance needs, both to lead up to a project getting funded and in the aftermath. And then we'll work together to better share the story and data around forest and watershed resilience and why that proactive work is so important. So those are some of the things we'll explore today. And with that, one last slide just to remind you of our analysts. Thank you for joining us today. So we've got, again, Ben Guillaume, Tom Goujon, Marian Whitman, and Courtney Young. And we'll take the slide share down and introduce our panelists. Okay. Welcome, everybody. So let's go ahead and just start with some quick intros. There's no particular order here, so I'm just going to go with the order I see on my screen and just ask you to introduce yourself and what motivates you as individuals to engage in this conversation on funding for forest and watershed resilience. So that's just a quick intro of who you are, what you do, and what's really motivating you. Let's go to Courtney first. Go ahead, Courtney.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me, Julie and Katie. I'm Courtney Young, and I work for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources in the Executive Director's Office. I'm the Forest Health and Wildfire Mitigation Program Administrator. It's a big mouthful. One of my main roles is to administer the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, or COSWAP, and that's a grant that's available statewide for wildfire mitigation efforts. Another hat that I wear sometimes is the administrator of the Forest Health Council, which is an advisory body to the Governor and General Assembly on forest health challenges and solutions. And so forest health, wildfire mitigation, resilience, community resilience is most of the work that I'm doing with the department. And I think I feel motivated to be a part of these conversations and work in resilience. Yeah, just witnessing the changing landscape, the changing climate, the excitement that people have, including myself, of like being out in the WUI, being out in the wilderness areas, and knowing like as population grows, impact on our landscape grows, and resilience to climate and wildfire and insects is ever more important. So I'm excited to be learning from everyone here also. These questions really had us thinking, and I'm excited to go back and listen to hear what the collaborative groups had to say in the last session as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Courtney. Let's go to Marianne next.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marianne Whitman. I'm the program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation Wildfire Resilience Initiative. My just a little bit about my background. I'm actually trained as a freshwater ecologist and worked in academia and then in land management for about 7 or 8 years before I came to the Moore Foundation and jumped into wildfire. And the way that I found it is I'm based in Santa Barbara, and UC, the University of California, has lands that are set aside for research and education. And as like y'all in Colorado, we have a lot of fire out here in California too, and really needed to develop a way to learn about and to implement more good fire on the ground. And so I learned a lot there about like what really matters in terms of the meaning behind the actions that we take to manage our lands, and that we're not just doing stuff, but we're doing stuff that's good for the environment and that helps protect communities and helps protect the ecosystems that we rely on. So I have been working with our initiative for the last 3 years or so, which is when the initiative kicked off. And our work is really focused on those mitigations that matter before the fire happens. And so I kind of think about fire as a cycle, but there are, rather than just responding to fires and the impacts that they cause, our initiative really focuses on what we can do before the fire occurs to really try to enable concepts like ecologically beneficial fire and increasing the resilience of communities, WUI communities, and others that live around fire. So what really kind of, I guess, helps drive and motivate me and in the context of the work that I do is really trying to understand those ties to ecosystem health and the ecosystem services provisioning that can be essentially supported to bring us to a better future in that way. I just a little bit too about our strategies that we conduct our grant making by, and I think the names of our strategies say a lot, so I won't kind of drag you deep with me into the details. But our top three strategies are called early fire interventions, and that work is really focused on one major project that is called the FireSat project. And this is a set of low Earth orbit satellites that are not just intended to sense fire quicker, but to put the tools in the hands of fire managers such that we can take advantage of wildfires that are out there and encourage beneficial fire and really have the tools that are needed to conduct this work in a way that's safe for firefighters, in a way that's safe for communities, but also in a way that can help us essentially bring our ecosystems back into some kind of equilibrium with respect to fire regime. The other top two strategies are called pre-fire ecosystem interventions and pre-fire community interventions. And those are really aimed at, with respect to the pre-fire ecosystem interventions, it's what are the actions that can be taken that can both promote a healthy ecosystem and an ecosystem that has a healthy fire regime. And those are two related, but not exactly the same concepts. So it's a complicated space, and that's one area in which we're working. And then finally, pre-fire community interventions really has to do with trying to disrupt those fire pathways that are coming into communities, and to implement those mitigations that matter in an efficient way that doesn't lead to essentially inefficiencies for those communities, and in a way that is sustainable over time. So that includes aspects of sustainable project finance that may support those kinds of activities. And this is both on the ecosystem side and the community side, and really trying to crack the nut about how our risk is estimated, how our hazard is estimated, and what that means for the work that's getting on the ground and that's being delivered on a daily basis by all of you good folks out there and everybody here on the call too. So I'll just kind of end real quick with I think one thing that really like motivates me and excites me about this work right now is that there's everyone's kind of pointed in the same direction. We all want healthy ecosystems. We don't want our communities to be essentially damaged and just obliterated by fires. And so we're all kind of rowing in the same direction, and it's a very exciting time. I think there's an acknowledgement of the role that our ecosystems play in this wildfire crisis, and I think there's some optimism about the future in terms of being able to measure and understand what we're doing and to use those measurements and that understanding to improve our systems. So thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Marianne. We'll double back and hear more about some of those metrics and outcomes in our next question too. Let me go to Tom and then Ben for those high-level intros as well around who you are, what you do, and what motivates you in these conversations.
Sure. Thanks, Julie. And sorry, Katie, too many French names on the panel. It's tough. I'm Tom Goujon. I'm the president at Gates Family Foundation. Gates is a private foundation that's place-based. We work statewide in Colorado. Our interest in this area is really just a part of a larger natural resources focus that's historically been mostly about private land conservation, water resource management, and at times forest health and watershed health. Increasingly, that area is becoming more important. But natural resources is just one of a series of topics we work on. So it's sort of a piece of the puzzle, but it's not like the dominant piece of the puzzle. I'd say we're happy to talk more about this when we get into it. But because of the scale that's required for direct interventions, like we're not typically that often a funder of a forest treatment. We're more often trying to either help support the infrastructure that allows that work to occur, or working with local partners and local governments who are trying to create dedicated funding streams that can in part be applied to those local efforts. And so those have been areas of more activity for us, as well as just thinking about the role that a more robust forest economy could play in all of this, and thinking about things like mass timber in particular, but also other components of a forest economy. So that's kind of our orientation. We have to be sort of opportunistic and selective about where we fund. My personal history with this, I think my first education on these issues came in like the mid-90s. I was on the Nature Conservancy board here for a decade and chaired it for 3 or 4 years, and learned a lot through that experience about the realities of our forests. And then I was on the Denver Water Board for 13 years, kind of 2005 to 2018, I think. And we launched the Denver Water Partnership with the Forest Service in that period. So was involved in the first couple of cycles of that work and how we try to prioritize what was most helpful to reduce risk and where the Forest Service priorities and Denver Water's priorities overlapped. And so again, got to see in a kind of more hands-on way on the ground. And that effort, I believe at this point, I've been off the board now for a while, I think almost $100 million invested in 120,000 acres impacted. So reasonably successful, pretty nascent effort when I was first involved.
Thanks, Tom. Let's go to Ben.
It works better if I mute myself. So Ben Guillon, I'm with the main hat that I'm wearing right now is the principal and founder at Net Earth. What we do is private-public partnerships around nature conservation. And how I got to that, initially, I'm a wildlife veterinarian. So I started my career in Africa, And I was always distraught by two things with our projects. First one is the small scale of anything we could do in Africa. And I was working for the World Bank, so we were still, you know, investing in millions of dollars, but only in millions of dollars at the scale of some of those countries. And then the bigger issue is what happens after our grant cycle, which is usually a 5-year grant, and usually all projects were left in the wild without funding. So that's really why 20 years ago I started really working on those public-private partnerships of how do you combine the partners to create business models that can be sustained over the years, and if possible, once it's been seeded by founders, if there is really a business model, how can you attract money from the market? Because right now we're excited when we get $1 million. There are trillions of dollars in the markets, so that's really the question: how do you channel that money to our projects? The other hats that I'm wearing, one is we also have a nonprofit that works with the Gates. We have a grant from the Gates Family Foundation to explore the very early stages of a PPP around the Colorado River. And I also work with Julian George very closely on the work initiative. And I'm also with Tom on the Colorado Forum, which is a group of CEOs in Colorado. We're trying to, do the right thing for Colorado, figure out how to involve the business community, which there is a lot of interest for. And I'm co-chairing the wildfire initiative for the Colorado Forum. So a lot of connections always back to how to get the private sector involved. And what really motivates me, it's, two sides of it. One is I live in Sedalia, and for those who know what Sedalia, it's directly again the Paxton Isabel National Forest. We're directly in the WUI. We moved in recently, but our neighbors still remember the Hammond fire and being on call for evacuation. So it's very personal, and it's also a great business opportunity. To be really honest, is that compared to anything else in the nature world where people kick the can down the road or try to deny the reality of climate change, of the collapse of biodiversity, it feels like, yeah, it's always an emergency, but for tomorrow. Wildfires, there is really no way around it. Nobody can claim that they don't exist. Everybody knows it's going to cost a lot of money. And so there is really an opportunity for business to work alongside funders to find solutions. So it's sad, but it's a good opportunity also to motivate all of that money.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We have so much to dig into, and folks in the audience, we are going to be taking your questions. I have a handful of questions as previously previewed, just to work through a little bit to get us started, but we're looking forward to what questions you have. It's notable that each of you really are just, interacting in different ways, sometimes really project specific, other times more kind of systems levers. For some of you, programs that are very much squarely focused on fire resilience, and for others, it's the broader frame of natural resources. And I think that's just one of the reasons this panel is great, because we get to hear from all these different angles. So in this next section, we'd like to keep letting you have some long form answers and dig in a little bit more to the work that you're doing, the particular funding models that you're working with related to forest and watershed resilience. And, it could be a program you're investing in, or specific projects that you want to highlight. But we wanted to hear more about As related to that work, what are the metrics and outcomes that you are prioritizing? I think we've started to hear some of that in some of your opening questions, but help us understand how you really look at what makes something credible, compelling, fundable, and then on the back end, how do you evaluate success? So that's a lot to ask for, but who wants to go first? Anyone? Otherwise, I'll do a quick roll call. Let's go to Tom. We'll work from like systems level and broader structure down to more project specific work. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like, our scale of investment like means that it's hard for us to be very often, not never, but very often like a direct funder of work on the ground. It's more often the capacity of organizations that are engaged or helping partners and or local governments figure out a way to dedicate resources so they can consistently engage in their own region. And then also thinking about like the role of the forest economy and the role even of technology, in making progress and getting more productive. I think everybody knows the math. I mean, the scale of acres that need attention and the current cost per acre of like doing anything that's meaningful, like, it's just a really daunting price tag. And so, I think we have gravitated initially probably towards locally based efforts just because that seemed like the place that there was the most opportunity. And there's still work going on in that realm, and I think those are important. I do feel many of the folks on this call are probably familiar with the goal of a measure that may be on the ballot in November that would actually dedicate resources at a more significant scale to both land conservation and wildfire risk mitigation. And again, because we're a private foundation, we can't like directly lobby on an issue like that once it's on the ballot, but we work with all the partners that are engaged on that topic and have been trying to help that effort indirectly and through those partners. And so, so there are these moments every once in a while where something, a bigger idea, like, does actually make it to a place where there's a potential for it to advance. And so, so I think that's for us, like, as you said, Julie, like we're just trying to look for like where are those points of leverage, whether it's in funding streams or in kind of unusual partnerships with stakeholders that haven't always been at the table, or something in the forest economy that we can see as a piece of the puzzle, even if it may not be the answer. And so I think that's kind of the niche we've worked in. I'm a big fan of Moore's work. I've watched what they've been doing. And so anxious to have you all hear more about that because I also think they're doing some really fabulous stuff. But that's kind of, for the moment, like the niche we occupy. And actually, I would say, even though we aren't direct funders of projects, I do think we think about some of the same things that direct funders think about. Like who's at the table, or what's the diversity of the stakeholders that are involved in these efforts? Are they narrow or broad? Are they getting the people that ought to be involved and engaged to the table? There's always questions about scale and impact, but I think even before that, always interested in like what data or decision tools are informing the choices and the priorities, and how articulate can people be about like why those acres, why this project, what's the goal? Is it is it life and property? Is it infrastructure? Is it habitat? Like, is it escape routes for a community? Like, what is it that we're trying to optimize? Because the whole game right now is basically making hard choices about those things because we don't have the resources to do it all. And so I think for me, like understanding what gets prioritized and what its ultimate contribution is to lowering risk, like that's no matter what role you play, that feels pretty important.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tom. Really helpful to hear that. And let's just keep building. Let's go back to Courtney because we haven't gotten a chance to hear from Courtney for a little while. So Courtney, what do you think about over at DNR in terms of um, what makes projects credible, what metrics and outcomes matter,
Yeah.
and how does that show up in some specific examples of the work you're doing?
Okay. Thanks, Julie. For folks who don't know, the COSWAP program, the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, has two funding opportunities. So one is a workforce development grant, and we have specific workforce development partners. They include the Department of Corrections, state wildland inmate fire teams. So that's a crew made up of incarcerated men who can fight fires when fires are raging in Colorado, and they can do mitigation work when they're not on fires. So that's sort of like an entry level pathway for these men for when they're released into forestry and wildfire. And we also work with the conservation corps to fund them to do important wildfire mitigation work. So that's our workforce development program. We also have a landscape resilience investment, which is another funding opportunity. It's available in COSWAP's strategic focus areas or in certain wildfire watershed footprints. And this is more of a traditional grant that people might be familiar with. We offer cash for cross-boundary, collaboratively developed strategic wildfire mitigation. And in that program specifically, when we're looking at projects and we're inviting folks to apply, some of the things we really value as a program is collaboration. So we ask anyone who's applying for this funding to gather their partners, discuss the values and the risks in their particular landscape, and collaboratively, like Tom said, like we'll use tools to select a project or multiple projects to submit to COSWAP for funding. And so we're asking people to tell us what projects are most important to them. We're asking them to do it collaboratively, and we're asking them to look cross-boundary. So either planning projects cross-boundary or considering what projects have already been done in that landscape and plan more work that's connected so that the impact can be bigger than the one parcel or the one value at risk so that it can be a part of a landscape solution. So at COSOP, we certainly understand that, acres treated or piles burned or acres broadcast burned is not the only metric, that there's a lot of conditions and work that has to go in before you can get to acres treated. And so when we're having people share their stories with us or share successes, we also really want to hear about all that work that was done before the treatment occurred, and we count those as success stories. We're putting together a 5-year impact report right now, and most of the successes, of course, we're highlighting the acres and the piles and the kind of classic risk reduction, but we're also really highlighting partnerships. We're highlighting landowner perspectives, changes in community perceptions of wildfire risk reduction, because we understand that's all a part of the process. So those are some of the things we're considering when it comes to metrics. And in terms of what makes a project credible or fundable, something we consider is if it's included in a regional or local planning effort. So CWPPs are pretty important for us when we're reviewing applications. We're asking folks, is this identified in a plan? And I think that helps us understand where it lies on the landscape in terms of its strategic nature. And yeah, and again, partnerships is really important for us. And those are things that we'll ask people when they're sharing a project with us. We'll want to know who was involved with the selection and how was it collaboratively developed and prioritized.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Let's stay on that project level and go to Marian, and then we'll go to Ben. So Marian, I know you started to tell us a bit about the programs you have, but let's dig in more just around, how you prioritize, what metrics and outcomes you're interested in, and what makes something credible.
Sure. Thanks, Julie and Thomas and Courtney. Really interesting to hear your remarks so far. So we, I would say that we work at many different levels, and where a lot of our effort comes in is through a set of pilot projects that we have going on out there. And our acronym for these pilots is SPARK, Select Pilots to Achieve Resilience with Key Indicators. And it's kind of a mouthful, but it's cute when you put it all together. And we all there's a million pilots out there in this world, right? And we don't want to just sort of have another set of pilots, and then once the philanthropic funding ends, then the effort ends. The point is something that Tom kind of touched on too, which is, we're not funding. We don't. The Moore Foundation doesn't fund, the treatment of areas. Those the dollars to cut a tree or to put some prescribed fire on the ground. We try to fund the capacity of an area, and with those grantees that are place-based, because uh, ecosystems matter, communities matter. These are all different places, and what we're trying to learn is, we know that one specific recipe does not fit all. But have you guys heard of this book called by Samin Nosrat, and it's called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat? And it's like a lovely cookbook, or a lovely kind of book on food. And there's a huge diversity of cuisine out there. And maybe you've got American cuisine, or maybe you've got like Korean cuisine, or maybe you have French cuisine, and they all have some combination of salt, fat, acid, heat that makes it delicious, but maybe different ingredients and maybe different combinations of those things. And so that's what we're trying to really learn from these sparks that are out there, which is not what's a rigid, template for doing what you need to do where you need to do, but what are the kind of things that you need, and then how do you drive it kind of from that local coalition, if you will, or local capacity. So we're really trying to extract the information from that kind of model with these pilots. We also have kind of, and those pilots are distributed. I mean, these places could not be any more different from one another. We have pilots in Alaska, in British Columbia, in Washington State, in California, North and South, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And these are different ecosystem types, different community types, and really trying to like understand, what that change is, and then have those pilots and the pilot communities exchanging with each other, and to make sure that that information gets out into the world and doesn't just sort of die with the pilot, if you will. So that's one aspect. The second thing is, we do kind of work also a little bit at a systems level, in so much that, policy and communications are such an important part of this very complex work, and trying to understand the ties between all of those things. Now, metrics. So the Moore Foundation, and as you may or may not know, the Moore Foundation was founded by Gordon Moore, who's the founder of Intel. And there's a tremendous culture at our foundation of measurement and evaluation and metrics. And so we spend quite a bit of time trying to identify these metrics that really get at measuring the change in a good way, or in a way with the least amount of uncertainty that's possible. And so for our pre-fire ecosystems work, our main metric there is really around the concept of ecologically beneficial fire and ecologically detrimental fire. And I'm overpronouncing because there's a lot of definitions of beneficial fire, and we're really aimed at that ecological impact, and what that means for fire regimes, and what that means for ecosystem functioning, and the same on the flip with the detrimental fire. With respect to our community strategy, we actually are using a model developed by Hussam Mahmoud, who's at Vanderbilt. It's called the Agnanar model, and it measures relative vulnerability of the built environment. And you can check out more about this model, but in lieu of getting mitigations in communities and then setting the communities on fire, modeling the reduction of vulnerability through validated and published methods is a way to get at the granularity of the actions that homeowners are doing, at the actions that communities are doing as well. And so these are some of the main kind of ways that we measure. One thing I think that's really important about metrics, and like what everybody's saying here, there's a lot of metrics that are out there that are great metrics, and then there's some metrics that show that you're just sort of doing stuff, but does that stuff really matter to the systems that you care about? And so I just encourage a deep look into what is it that you're measuring, and what is it that is the outcome for that, and look at things over the long term. I described I was an aquatic ecologist. I worked in fisheries management for about 2 decades, and our country has a deep history of coming quickly and kind of getting solutions on the ground. And then lo and behold, 50 years later, it's like, oh, we should not have done that. We should not have introduced those fish to those places because here's what's happening now. So keeping an eye on what does this mean for the future and utilizing forest, ecology and landscape ecology and those kinds of aspects, I think are really important. One kind of example of this, we're working with a group of researchers called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, and I'll put the link in the chat here. They've developed this beneficial fire readiness approach. This is unpublished, it's experimental, but it really, what it does is it tries to bring in those ecological concepts into the readiness of our landscapes to be able to accept ecologically beneficial fire or not. And this is based on principles of fire deficits and surpluses, known fire return intervals, and it utilizes some of those data sources that are out there that are getting better and better by the day. So I'll stop there. I could kind of go on forever about metrics, but happy to talk more about some of these aspects.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks. Ben, how would you respond to that question around, examples of funding mechanisms that you've been using and what metrics and outcomes and other indicators of, credibility and success you look at?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I was trying to think about that, and it really boils down to the amount of long-term funding. So again, we're not looking at just, what's the next year, but all of the projects that we're doing, the questions we're asking is that really gonna move the needle in that sense that we're gonna have billions of dollars available over the next 10 years. And the reason we're trying not to, although I have scientific background, not to get onto the science side is that it can, the interest of the private sector sometimes can really taint the science. So instead, what we do is we work very closely with partners, especially the U.S. Forest Service, the State Forest Service, the National Forest Foundation, and we come in as partner to them on the funding side, rather than trying to, create our own science to justify the investments. The way we work is really two different levels. One is what we call system architecture, which is usually where agencies will come to us or some of the foundations and say, well, the system is not working the way it is. We can put more money, but it's just not, it requires rethinking it. And that's how we got involved with work. It's actually Denver Water who took us, asked us to jump in and to think about what would that mean to bring in the private sector into wildfire mitigation, and not just another brewery cutting a $10,000 check, which is great, supports your local wildfire collaborative, but doesn't allow you to do really work at scale. So that's the first thing, is creating those enabling conditions. The second one is really, as you say, Julie, on the project by project basis. And so it could be like we created a partnership in the Roaring Fork Valley with a luxury company called Xenia. And that allowed us to sponsor, and those were grants, so that was through our nonprofit side. And we gave a bunch of money to the local fire departments, to the Forest Service, either for post-fire restoration or for a lot of wildfire mitigation work around Aspen. And here, again, the idea was not that it was a one-off, or it was like, hey, if we can do that work around Aspen and we can convince the people in Aspen or that vacation in Aspen that it can be done, that there are channels to do that, creating a concept of what we call the Friends of the National Forest, so they can donate. They have a vehicle to easily donate money for those type of work, we can start with that first commitment, which was $700,000, and really add many zeros. We had a dinner with some of the clients of that company, Zinnia, and at the end, the family office of Tim Cook gave a call to the CEO of Zinnia and asked how his family office could get involved and help. And so that's really what we're trying to do with those projects, is figure out how do you scale things up through innovation as well. So with the Forest Service, for example, in actually not very far from you, Marian, in SoCal, working on, we're trying to understand the system for wildfire ignitions around highways, and what creates the ignition, and how can you stop the ignition to turn into a catastrophic wildfire. And so we're going to launch some innovation challenges to try to source new ideas and new technologies that can be deployed by the California Department of Transportation, Caltrans, and just create all that innovation around innovation ecosystem around the highway system, and how to source those investment opportunities, which is exactly what we're looking for at the end. We're a partner in that ecosystem with the foundations and the agencies. Ideally, for example, in that example in SoCal, at the end, some startups have a great idea, and we can partner with them and put money with them so that they can grow and help solve the issue. So it's just, although we're the private sector, we're investment driven, we're here also as a partner at the table, and try to change the system so that we can pour more money into finding solution alongside the nonprofits and the foundations.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'm starting to wish this was like a full day workshop that we could all, or at least half day, that we could all chat about these topics, because there's so much more to follow up on and ask. I noted that the collaboration and capacity building, and then just like the relational piece of it, right? Were things that you all touched on in one way or another in so many terms. But then also speaking to both at the system and the project level, thinking about what change you're trying to create and how you're articulating that, I think has been an important thread throughout this. I want to dig in a little more, and this time we're gonna it doesn't have to be a lightning round, but I want to just start getting you all just kind of interacting with each other's comments a little bit more on a few topics. I want to talk more about funder collaboration, right? So you've talked about collaboration within a community, but some of the questions that we know that collaboratives posed on the first call were around the roles of public-private partnerships, and also just how funders work together. So I'm curious just to share your thoughts on on those topics, including how you motivate and motivate other funders or other partners to come to the table from either a private public perspective or otherwise. But you all are already motivated on this topic, but what have you experienced in terms of trying to work together and bring in other funders and kind of align what you're doing? Thoughts on that? Maybe I can pose it to Tom and Ben first from the perspective of, Tom, you both mentioned your interactions with the forum. Tom, you talked about being on the Denver Water Board, like maybe speaking more to, how some of those partnerships have come together and what kind of motivated more people to come in.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I still feel like in the pure philanthropic funder world, at least like here in Colorado, the universe of people who are engaged is pretty small. And I think that's not unique. The number of people who are actively engaged with land conservation or water resources is also small. And so I do think, there's some potential there, but probably the greater potential is really both public sector partners and the broader private sector that Ben's talking about. I think one of the things that work has done really well, I remember that the meeting that was held up in Berthoud, for me, after I don't know what, 25 years of watching how things have worked in this area of forest health and sort of our ability to intervene effectively. It's kind of the first time that really felt like most of the people who have a stake in like the outcomes were actually in the room. I just think it's taken a long time to get. I mean, I even remember when Denver Water, like we were out like trying to proselytize to Colorado Springs and Pueblo and Northern, and like this is something we all have a stake in. Like we're all just assuming somebody's going to manage our watershed and protect our system, and it's not going to happen. So like you got to get in the game and and then XL, like it's starting to face its realities, and and then mountain communities and the recreation industry, and like slowly, like the insurance industry, like the world started to realize, like there's no like sitting this one out, like, and I do feel like if there's potential, and even local governments, like historically, I think you could have counted on less than one hand how many local governments had a dedicated funding stream to worry about the public forest above them. And so that's all started to change. And I feel like it's not nearly enough, but at least like the conversation is better. And I feel like, I think somebody said earlier, like more people are looking in the same direction. Like the realities of this problem are so in our face, and climate's role in that and stressing these systems and decades of fire suppression and all the stuff that we all know. Like, I think now whether we can be effective now that we're like all in the room, that's like a totally different question. But I think I do feel like that's like a slight reason for optimism if we can actually be effective as partners. And I still think long way to go on that, in ways that are at least more than just symbolic or like being empathetic to the problem, but not really imagining being part of an actual solution.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom.
Yeah, and I think that the difficulty always working with between foundations and the private sector is that the IRS has a lot of rules on how we can partner together, which is in part why we are a hybrid organization with a nonprofit, because there are some things that do not belong to the for-profit realm. But I think that I would totally echo what Tom is saying, that one of the goals is to move away from at least with the private sector, to get them in maybe on the philanthropic side, but move away from that, because the philanthropic dollars are always limited. Especially right now, if you're asking any company, they've got very little to give away in terms of dollars. But if you can have a conversation not with the chief marketing officer, but the chief risk officer or the chief financial officer, because suddenly they're saying, oh boy, if there is a fire, we're going to lose that plant. And we spent, $10 billion building that plant. Now, the type of budget that you can get for the work is very, very different. Because just to give you a sense that you're going back to that partnership with the Xenia family, so they had forest management in their blood going back over 100 years, because they were already the founder of the company in the 1920s was already passionate about restoring forests for the benefit of his workers, who had bought a bunch of land and replanted things. So you've got a family that's very wealthy, that has a company that's based in the US. Aspen is their main markets. And even with all of that, all you get is a $700,000 commitment over 3 years, which is still, I mean, it's great, but we need to be realistic in terms of what you can get from those companies when you're going on for the philanthropic money. So a lot of the work that needs to be done is exactly what Tom has done with Denver Water, is to reframe it as an operational issue. And it could be as simple in Aspen. We're just telling all those brands that it's if the trees disappear around Aspen, Aspen disappears, and those people move away, and all the investments that they've made will disappear. So we're not asking for them to be nice and to give us money. It's just, if you want to protect your investment, you better really invest in your forest. Same conversations we're having with Vail Resorts in the valley, is that Vail without the trees is not going to work. Or if you've got landslides on I-70, nobody's going to the resorts Now we're working even with the Department of War. They never really saw the wildfires as an issue, and now they're realizing that, it could be a smart move by anybody attacking the US to start by setting all the forest on fire, so that we can see, we can deploy planes. And so that just creates a very different conversation with DOW, and the different contractors there. So we just need to move the conversation from pure philanthropy, which is still very important. And that's what gets us going first. But the big money comes from more the operational issues.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Um, I want to follow up, Marian, around specifically a question for you around ecosystem markets, because you've been talking about ecosystem services and benefits, and I'm just curious. You're welcome to answer the public-private and alignment questions in general, but just I hear a lot in spaces that I travel to around the importance of ecosystem service markets as a way to get more partners involved, and I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Ben and Tom kind of set that up really nicely too. I'm seeing a lot of the same things, and Ben, what you're saying in particular, which is there's a protection of investments that like is basically a great motivator to come on in, right? And I think that like in really just a short amount of time, that in just a couple of years I've seen that change. And I'll talk first about like the foundations out there. And there's kind of a funny and overused saying of like, if you know one foundation, then you know one foundation, and what motivates them essentially. And when we kicked off our initiative, we had an effort called the Wildfire Resilience Funders Network. And there were foundations that sort of joined the conversation, but I'll say that everybody, all these different foundations have their own missions. They might be ecosystem funders or climate funders or community funders or whatever. And fire touches all of those things, but people didn't really know how to get involved or have a strategy on that front. And I think the maturation of the field to have like Department of War, or other agencies, these are public organizations or also like private foundations that are getting in and really trying to like understand their role in it. And I would say today there's a lot more of that kind of niche filling, if you will, which I think has led to a little bit more coordination and a little bit more, sort of moving in the same direction as each other. And that's where the kind of public-private partnerships, I think, fit into your question, Julie, about, ecosystem services. And in particular, I think the concept of fire and water is one that may have a lot of legs to stand on. And what I mean by that is water, freshwater resources. We've valued those. We drink water, we clean water, we fish out of water, all the things. And so there's been, and especially in Colorado, Colorado has amazing assessments of, the value of freshwater in the state. And that I think goes a long way in terms of making for environmental protections, right? Because we can sort of quantify something that's otherwise kind of amorphous. And so there's a lot of really interesting ideas out there right now. I mean, there's organizations like Blue Forests that are working with forest resilience bonds. There's the Salt River Project in Arizona, folks like Elvie Barton and, this big collaborative that she's leading down there, where, all the stakeholders essentially that participate in the ecosystem service, the recipients of the ecosystem services that are provided by forests, by landscapes, by groundwater, by carbon sequestration, by all these kinds of things out there, offers the opportunity to value and create essentially, revenues that can help with some of the landscape level stewardship that's not just aimed at cutting trees down, but that's aimed at essentially kind of restoring and rehabilitating landscapes so that that water that we drink is a little bit less per cup. Those fish that we fish are a little bit easier to find, and so on and so forth. So I do think that there's some really interesting models out there, and utilities and other like Denver Water, here in California, Southern California Edison, PG&E, they are coming in and they're, participating in a way where their assets are essentially being protected, but they are uh, absolutely, I think, diving headfirst into this concept of, what are the things that can sort of provide these ecosystem services and therefore keep our ecosystems, operating in a way that is healthy and good for us. Now, this is where I come back to the metrics part because it's one thing to participate in a stated model like that, but it's another thing to really measure what you're doing and understand that these treatments or these activities are indeed benefiting the environment and not just satisfying today's needs for a financial model, if that makes sense. And so that's where the long-term vision again and that understanding of our ecosystem functioning and the role that it plays in the ecosystem services that we receive are, I think, an important piece to be very clear on.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. Courtney, I'm going to pose this in a secondary question to you as well. And then folks in the audience, I want to hear your questions. So please, if you want to use chat, you can put them in there. That might be the most efficient so we can pitch them to our panelists. But Courtney, I welcome your thoughts on this public-private partnership piece. And I also want to circle back to these timeline questions. I think most panelists have answered those in one way or another. You've talked about the need for prioritization and capacity ahead of time. And folks have spoken to like the long-term impacts as well. So thoughts from you, Courtney, on public-private partnerships, and also any thoughts on like the role of, just take your funding programs, for example, in terms of that overall timeline of thinking about what's needed for long-term success. So two-parter for you.
Thanks, Julie. I think that, yeah, the other folks on the panel have spoken really well to the public-private partnerships. I'll say, in terms of the Department of Natural Resources, the COSWAP program, from a program perspective, because I really work at the program level, we don't have any official public-private partnerships, but we do share projects and expenses and match with many utilities across the state. So, Northern Water and Colorado Springs Utility and electric utilities are all contributing to the projects that we're funding in one way or another. Either they're the recipient and they're planning or they're providing funds. And so we see the public-private partnerships overlap on projects specifically rather than for us in like a planning level. We do collaborate, I'd say, more with other state funding opportunities. So, like the Colorado Water Conservation Board has its Wildfire Ready Watersheds program, and we've really specifically partnered with CWCB in order to offer our grants in their planning footprints so that people who are participating in these huge planning efforts can have some implementation funds come in and help them carry on momentum. So we do try to leverage state resources in order to make folks who are preparing for wildfire more successful. So I think there's, yeah, more to learn around public-private partnerships for us, and we're really enjoying utilities as I would say our main private partner so far. And then I think your other question was around timelines. And maybe how funding fits into this like long-term timeline of forest resilience. And it's a great question. And yeah, I think part of it is funding capacity, which we do within our landscape resilience investment. We fund forestry programs for many of our grantees. So instead of saying you can only use our funding to work on a project, you can use COSOP funding to build partnerships, to attend important meetings, to do planning efforts, to do outreach to landowners who are going to be partners or recipients 10 years from now. And so I think we're trying to be really flexible with what we even perceive as implementation. Like we are implementing partnerships, you're implementing strategy. Something that Katie brought up in one of the first slides from the last panel was around, the metrics that funders are looking for often aren't realized when the grant ends. after 4 years. And so I'm thinking, wow, maybe we should be sending out, I don't want to give anyone more work to do or more reports to fill out, but we collect most of our metrics, most of our success stories as soon as the grant closes. And I'm wondering if we might be able to, I want to use the word like harvest or like receive more stories and more metrics of success if we were to check in with people 2 years down the line to see how the conversations or the projects that COSLAP helped funded have changed what's happening in a community or have been, used as a match for other funds going forward. So I'd love to continue programmatically to expand our timeline past the endpoint of the project in order to capture more of the longer term impacts.
Thanks for that, Courtney. Let's go to Kim's question in chat, and then Ben, I saw your hand up too. Maybe you have a question for everyone. Let me go to Kim from Envision Chafee's question. She asked specifically, Marian, can you please talk a bit more about measuring reductions in relative vulnerability, and can you give an example?
Sure thing. Let's see, I'm gonna share a slide for just a minute, and it's gonna give me and others sort of some PTSD from like math or physics class from a long time ago, but bear with me on this. I'll kind of show the background on this a little bit. And so can you see a slide that says graph theory of network analysis? Okay, great. So this is, as I mentioned, we're using the models of Hussam Mahmood from Vanderbilt University. And this is just the model background behind it. And the model is called AGNI-NAR, AGNI-NAR. And I'm not even going to pretend to be able to remember that acronym right now. But what it is a graph theory model that really is focused on how to capture essentially the fuel. So it's the built environment and the vegetation that's around it, interact at a community scale as a network. And it's sort of modeled as a group of nodes, if you will. And each of those nodes sort of has properties about it that are essentially flammable. And then the connections between those nodes are also ways to capture the flammability of what those are. And so what we're doing is, and one example that we're working in is in Colorado, in Marble, Colorado. And essentially the entirety of the community of Marble was modeled using this kind of structure. And it gets real detailed, right? And so you can see, some of these little pictures here showing like the building. And so we're modeling down to, and this is all generated through kind of one agreement with the people in Marble. So there's no like secret pictures being taken of anybody. This is a community effort. And we're also doing this in communities in, Lake Tahoe, Nevada, for example, where the communities are working with us. Hussam will model the community with the level of detail that shows things like the nature of the eaves, the decks, the roof, the windows, the gutters, all of those things. And essentially the vulnerability of those buildings to combustion are being calculated. And the relationship of the adjacent properties and the adjacent buildings and the vegetation are being calculated. And each building, so each of these nodes essentially has a vulnerability calculated for it, and then we average it over the whole community. And as you might imagine, some buildings are more vulnerable. Some buildings are more important in the network aspect, meaning the fire flow, the continuous, sort of set of fuels, homes or vegetation to move through the community. So it also tells you that not every home needs to be mitigated. Not every home needs to be mitigated essentially with all the mitigations. It's some of the homes need to be mitigated with some of the mitigations. We use those recommendations from the model to meet with the community. We show them what this is. They make their own decisions about what it is they want to do and about what kind of average vulnerability they want to get to for their community or what they can get to. Of course, nobody wants any vulnerability, right? But there's only so much you can do to get you to different kinds of levels of safety. So this is kind of just a quick high level example and of how we do this. And then after the mitigations are implemented, then Hussam can run the model again and show what that reduction in vulnerability is. So these communities like in Marble and in Glenbrook and Tahoe, or in Tyrolean Village and also in Lake Tahoe, are working to essentially receive that information. They work with some of the state providers of subsidies for mitigations to try to get those dollars, implement those mitigations, and then Hussam will run the model again. And those communities are choosing really where they want to go given this type of analysis that's out there. So hope that helps, Kim, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marianne. And I'll just note, I think it's Envision Chafee, among others, that working with Colorado Forest Restoration Institute have also been looking at, maybe it's not the same, right, a vulnerability assessment methodology, but looking at where do you get your best bang for your buck and reducing risk, right? So there's, I think, some interesting models out there, which speaks to some of what you all said earlier about what makes something credible and the work that goes in for prioritization.
Yeah, and I'll put, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll put in the chat. Our grantee that's working in Tahoe developed a playbook, which kind of makes a lot of this a little bit more ingestible. And I'll put the link in the chat here so folks can see that.
Perfect. I see Courtney's hand up. So let me go to Courtney because you have a question for yourself in the chat too, Courtney. And then we're going to come back to Ben after that. Courtney, there's a question about the timing of bringing private funders in. So I don't know if that's why you had your hand up, but we'll turn it to you to maybe serve a dual purpose. Courtney, you're
Of course, thanks. I was going to say the researcher at Vanderbilt that Marianne mentioned, we also have a grantee who's planning and organizing or using COSWAP funds to plan risk reduction in a community in the Roaring Fork Valley using that same kind of node model. So I think the results of that just came out, and we're really excited to see how that influences the planning of a project that will receive COSWAP funding. And then Julie, you mentioned the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute and the Envision Chaffee County mapping project. And I just want to also note that COSWAP has contracted with CFRI to do an analysis of our program, looking specifically at the round one of our landscape resilience investment and how those projects reduce risk locally, but also at the landscape level, since that's really the how we need to be looking if we're going to be impacting wildfire risk reduction to communities. It's more than just a small project, it's the landscape level. So we're really excited. We're hoping to have the results from that back next summer. And so that'll be something maybe we can even do a branching out all about.
Awesome. And Courtney, do you want to speak really quickly to that question about when you bring in the private funders?
Yes. So COSWAP itself doesn't do any coordinating with the private funders. That would be something that our grantees are coordinating for match. So yeah, I would say both Denver Water and Colorado Springs utilities are quite active in planning for wildfire risk reduction in their watersheds. And so when our grants are available, the grantees that we work with are often well connected to those utilities and seem to be the coordination seems to be simple and the relationships are already built. And so getting match from the utilities is pretty common with our grantees that are working in their watersheds.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Let's go to Ben. And Chaska, thanks for your comments as well in the chat. Let's go to Ben next.
Well, I don't want to hijack the the panel, but it's kind of turning the question to the three other panelists of how early the private sector can be involved, because what we see is that two different trends is that either people design something, all the nonprofits kind of design their perfect model, and then they bring in the private sector once it's already cooked. And that's when we realize that, metrics are not necessarily the right one, or some of the assumptions have not been validated early enough. And then there is really a lot of friction there. Or we have a model where we get involved early, but then, there is no first mover advantage in that sense that the everything that's produced then becomes available to everybody else. And in some way, someone who's waiting, not investing in the relationship, and then jumping in at the last minutes to participate, wins by not making the investment. So we've always struggled a little bit in how, the right entry point to be able to work with the foundations, especially now we're moving away from the philanthropy side of the business to more the operations. And so just wanted to see if the other panelists had some idea where the right entry point is.
Yeah, I'll start. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think there's this balance, the community aspects of things, like is it really a solution that like there's broader community buy-in and acceptance? Like it's hard to skip that part, but that tends to be somewhat localized. And so if you're trying to bring in, bigger scale partners, like finding the right balance between those things where I don't think most people living in, vulnerable communities want to delegate, like in some ways, to corporations. Like, what's the game plan? At the same time, like you don't, as you said, don't want to wait till the end. Like, I've got this whole idea, and here's the price tag, and like, come help me. I think some of it comes down to people too. Like, I've been just curious to watch the evolution of some of these organizations, both like public utilities, but also some corporations where you start out in an era where this is nobody's job, like nobody has the expertise internally and nobody's really thinking about what's their risk and what's their solution. And then you start to get people inside of the organizations. And I'm super impressed now with like the depth of climate and forest health knowledge inside of some of these utilities. It's significant. And those people just weren't really there historically not that long ago. And so I feel like that makes a lot more possible. I just don't know, like in the corporate world, I don't have as good enough a window to see like where are they at in that. I think public utilities and electric and water have sort of learned the need for that, but I don't know, where the corporate world is.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ben. I'm going to weave in Chaska's question too, just for if one or two people want to take it before we do a final question. Because I think it's kind of related. It's this idea that, if you're trying to get a lot of folks involved in funding, are funders specifically worried about being able to tout the outcomes of their own funding and investment in a landscape, or is it sufficient to talk more holistically about the aggregate impacts and benefits of, a project with multiple sources? And Tom, I think you, you spoke to that a little indirectly in some ways about, folks being in it for that greater need and good, perhaps, but I'm curious if others have thoughts on that. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll jump in on that. Yeah, this is a great point, right? Like, because none of this, we have kind of a way we talk about it, and we call it Operation More Together Than Alone, because there is no way, a few things. One, with the funding cuts that happened at the federal level, even if you amassed all of the dollars that foundations, typically are making grants with, it still wouldn't fill that gap, And so there is not time for inefficiency or for funders to be kind of operating in their own little bubble, in my opinion. I think that's why, we try to spend a lot of time, talking with other funders, and importantly, to try to get the understanding of the problem, to be a common understanding. And again, Tom was making a good point that it's been like lightning speed in terms of agencies, utilities, foundations, organizations are acquiring this information very quickly. And so an important part is to I lots of different models are out there. There's pooled funding, there's co-funding, there's lots of different ways to do it. But to be able to actually scale and like approach this problem, it's a operation more together than alone kind of aspect. And I think it's really important to talk to your peers, for all of us to talk to our peers and understand like what are the good ideas that can make an impact and try to get together if they can.
Thanks, Marianne. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to leave you with a lightning question, so 30 seconds each. And that is really just around what are the opportunities for funders and the collaboratives represented in this call to work together in terms of sharing the stories and data around the need for this work. So if there was one idea, it doesn't have to be the idea, but one idea of thinking about next steps for how collaboratives listening in can work together with funders. We'd love to hear that. And that might also inspire our next steps in thinking for that, the fall summit, and what else we might explore. So, popcorn, anyone want to go first? Ideas for how collaboratives and funders could be working together to strengthen the story and the message. Marianne?
I'll go first. I would say you did it here a little bit. That slide that we had in the beginning of the ROI takeaways. To me, I'm tired. These are important images, but I'm tired of seeing the community burnt down, and then we are like we lost again. When there's so much kind of positive kind of coming out right now, and so sharing those things like the ROI takeaways or the wins that are out there are like that creates a lot of like momentum and magnetism in my opinion. So share the good stories, share those numbers that show results coming back too.
Great, thanks, Marianne. Courtney, did you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking about how, collaboratives want to share their stories, but also funders want to share their stories with the legislature, the folks who approve the budgets every single year. So we are also trying to tell the positive impact that CoSwap has. And so when people, it's like sounds so boring, but when people fill out the final report really robustly and share pictures and create narratives, like we pull those directly into our presentations that we give to the legislature. And so I would say like site visits and final reports and even like sharing in an email, it could be a year later, like the impact and some pictures. Those are things that funders I think can really easily take and pull up and like put into the spotlight to help tell the story to essentially the funders of the funders, which is the legislature and the General Assembly and the governor. And so we're always looking for those because it's a little bit hard for CoSwap to write that. So those would be some ways to work together.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Courtney. Ben?
Yeah, I would say for us, it's for the private sector, is for the collaborative to be able to put themselves into the shoes of those companies in that sense that a lot of the stories are told from what the community needs, but the reality, you need to think about what Denver Water needs, what the company need, and that's where really you can find real amount of funding. Right, Denver Water will invest in some watersheds because it matters to their water. And so if you can speak that language to the team there, you can get a lot of money. If you just say they need to protect you because they owe it to you, or because they should be protecting the forest, generate things like that don't really connect. So really understanding what will connect with the private sector and telling that story will go a long way.
Thanks so much, Ben. Tom, last but not least, quick thought.
Yeah, I think partly it's just like knowing your lane. Like philanthropy is theoretically more agile and risk and innovation capital, but it's the smallest. And so, I think Denver Water, my experience was we have 5 appointed board members who could decide this needs to be part of the rate base and we're going to make it part of the business model. We didn't have to go to the voters, didn't have to ask anybody if that was okay. We just did it and decided it was important. And, but if you're inside a public company or like the world is very different. And so I don't think there's just one model of how collaboration works, but there's got to be some entity that can be the glue that causes that to come together and understands the lane everybody can be in and what their motivations are. And that's the hardest part, frankly. Like it's actually literally the hardest part.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Well, we're hoping through some of these conversations, like this one and the prior one, and some of the other ones that the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative and Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network are hosting, that we can at least start to understand that coordination and opportunity. We thank everyone for being here today. First and foremost, our panelists, thank you so much. And then, of course, everyone listening in. These conversations will continue, as Katie mentioned, at the Fall Summit and some other work that we're pulling together to draw these lessons learned. So please stay tuned, and there's more to come. And again, thanks for your time and for the couple extra minutes to help round us out today.